Hello, 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 hello. Go on, we'll throw in another one and say hello. How are you all doing? Welcome to another whiskey review with me, the Whiskey Novice. Now, I am still whipping my way around distilleries which I have yet to review, and this time it's the turn of another grain. This time it is an SMWS bottling G10G, meaning grain, where SMWS is concerned, 10.39, and we know because we've done a bit of googling that is Stratchclyde, and this time it's a 16-year-old Stratchclyde. So let's look at Stratchclyde quickly, shall we? In the Gauls of Glasgow, owned by Chivas, so Pernod Ricard, yeah, and founded in 1927. Another great big, well, I'd say great big, but most of them are industrial grain distillery. So Stratchclyde fitting in there as another grain whiskey to be reviewed as part of this series. I did say a few reviews back, whenever I reviewed the North British, that I would sort of look at what grain whiskey was in general. We haven't done that yet, so let's do that very, very quickly. Grain whiskey in Scotland, certainly. Grain we usually talk about in the terms that it's not barley. Of course, grain takes in barley in conversation, but usually I like to put it in terms of cereal to cover all of that barley and all the other grains. So grain, then, we're talking about it in Scottish terms. Grain whiskey will have a portion of malted barley in there. This comes from the technical file. Well, that malted barley is in there because of the enzymes that it holds within it. It's usually, getting a little technical, beta amylase, which help with the production of the sugar to be converted to alcohol. And it's usually the cereals, the grains that we're looking at in Scotland are maize/corn and wheat are the ones that are usually used. So we're looking at Scotch whisky distillery there of grain, and it'll be produced in a column, continuous coffee, whatever you want to call it, still. So grain whiskey in Scotland cannot be produced in a pot still. Yes, you could do it. I mean, you know, there's none, but I mean, you couldn't legally release it as Scotch single grain if it were produced in a pot still. So single grain, by the technical file, as we know it, must be produced in a column still. So that's a quick flight over it. Let's get into this one. Bottled at 59.2%. Sweet. It is sweet. It's whatever it may be, wheat or corn/maize generally tend to be sweet anyway. Think bourbon once again. Loads of sharpness. You know, it's those typical citrus sharpness notes. But there's also sort of wild, I'm going to say green, untamed notes about it. What I mean by that? Well, it's sort of like a wild there's some sort of weird wild vegetative notes about it. It's a bit tight, it's a bit quiet, so let's see what the palate brings out. As expected. Sweet, sharp, slightly salty delivery. This is sharp, it's strong. That 59.2 shows up in the palate. I think the problem, or certainly the issue that I found there, was that the nose was so tight and gave up so little. You could then fall into the trap that this is quite low in alcohol. We know it's 59.2%, but that 59.2% does not show up in the nose. It all shows up in the palate. And it all shows up as such sour as well, salty and sour. Where the palate, where that map of the tongue picks up salty and sour, weirdly the sweetness calms down a little and it all becomes salty and sour. There's also a weird winey note off it. vanillas to a certain extent, caramel, yeah, to a certain extent, lots of citrus, lime, and all of that lime goes right to the back of the palate. So sharpness, yes, now the hints of bitterness start to come through as well. It's all very sharp and sweet, and well, as I say, sweet. The sweet shows up in a weird, more citric acid sort of thing. And yeah, oaky notes. Yeah, to be expected. Finish isn't actually that bad. Once all of that sour, and the only reason I keep saying sour is because the map of the tongue shows where sour technically is picked up on the tongue, and this is just firing off left, right, and centre. Everything else is quite calm, quite balanced, quite mellow. But those sour receptors on the tongue are just, they're the initial shock, and saltiness isn't a million miles away from that either, so it's definitely playing into it. The finish, loads of fresh fruit in the finish. I've had better, but I've had worse. Let's add some water. So it's had some water, it's had some time. The nose is still a little tight. There's some weird green funky notes going on in that nose, which aren't overly pleasant. There's sort of slight uric acid and even ammonia. There's just that. There's some weird sort of not terribly pleasant note on there, but it's just very, very slight. Yeah, water didn't really change the palate an awful lot, but what I will say is I would tire of this very, very quickly. It's not the best of grain whiskies I've had. It lacks something. What that something is, I'm not quite sure, but hell, it is what it is. So then, what would I recommend as an alternative? Well, like most grain whiskies, they can be a little bourbon-like. And I did this the last time. I'm going to do it this time again. I'm going to suggest to you a bourbon. And it wasn't one that I liked terribly much whenever I tried it, but there was certain hints of what reminded me of it. It's the Woodford Reserve. And I know an awful lot of people love Woodford Reserve. I wasn't a huge fan. I wasn't a huge fan in the same way that I'm not a huge fan of this. But what I'm suggesting then is that if there's certain, and I'm going to say younger grain whiskies that you've had from independent bottlers in Scotland, that they're closer to the bigger bourbon hitters, because a lot of the life is still left in them. Now, I don't mean that to sound negative toward some of the other older grain whiskies. They just tend to be an awful lot softer because they've just got so much age on them. A lot of the vibrancy in grain whiskies remains whenever they're that bit younger. Now, 16 years isn't young, but it is in the terms of grain whiskey, because grain whiskies generally tend to, certainly the independently bottled ones, as far as I can see, tend to just be left until they're that bit older. So Woodford Reserve is the one that I would recommend if you've had some of the younger grain whiskies and you like them in Scotland. I said it prior to this, whenever I reviewed the Fragrant Drops North British, that if grain whiskey is your thing, if you really like grain whiskey that much, you should really be drinking or certainly trying bourbon, because let's face it, that's technically what bourbon is. So there, that's my suggestion. If you have had a younger one, I don't know what, I can't even remember what price I paid for this. It's probably 16 grain, probably around the 50 to 60 pounds mark. So it wasn't that expensive really for a 16-year-old whiskey, but grain whiskey tends to be that bit cheaper anyway. Yeah, there's just not an awful lot of life in the nose of this. and the palate's all about that sour sharpness. So we'll leave it there. And I'll say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very, very much to my patrons. Should anybody wish to join that group and show the channel a little more support, the details are in the video description below. I'll be back the next time. Until then, please look after yourselves. Here's to your good health. Cheers.
Hey, thanks for watching my video. Please click and subscribe to be notified of further content.